Hey everybody, this is Dominic DeAngelo of AdFreeShows.com. Today's date is January 12th, 2023. A new year and some exciting, crazy times in wrestling. It's been nuts, and I'm happy to have with me here a man that everybody is familiar with if you tune into SiriusXM. It is Busted Open's David LaGreca. Dave, man, I'm so pumped to have you today. Thank you for joining me.
No, I'm so excited to be on, and it's been a while. We've been planning this for a while, so it's great to connect, and I'm really honored to be on with you. Thank you.
Well, it's so cool because I would see you at wrestling shows too when I would be covering press and things like that, and we kind of connect a little bit here and there. But then I kind of then I was assigned on Wrestling Inc. to start time stamping the Busted Open show. So it was really the first kind of experience I got to get to listen to Busted Open radio on a regular basis too, especially. And then it blew my mind because like I told you off air, I'm a Jets fan, and so I would always try to listen to New York radio. And here, your brother Don is on the Michael K show. And I was like, holy shit, he's got a brother in wrestling or in sports and radio. And it's like, and me and my brother, we both kind of work for AdFreeShows. So I was like, there's a wild dynamic. Can you talk about the relationship with your brother real quick and how you
Yeah,
guys kind of got into the radio business?
yeah. First and foremost, my brother and I are very close, and we used to do mock radio shows together when we were kids. Like we would set up like a tape recorder in our room and do like a talk show. This is going back early '80s, so
Mhm.
a long time ago. And my brother's story is different than mine. My brother was a star pitcher. Actually, got a scholarship to Ramapo on a baseball scholarship, and he was a pitcher. And in his time in college, he majored in communications, and he fell in love with radio, and then he had to make the decision to pursue a career in baseball or pursue a career in radio. And it was the wise choice because it's so difficult to do, to follow that athletic road. So he he quit baseball and just committed to radio, and that's all he ever wanted to do. Once he was in college, and and as soon as he graduated, that's pretty much the only work he's ever done is radio. And he started off and just built his career over time, and now does what he does. And for me, it's completely different. I majored in communications when I was in college,
Mhm.
but once I finished school, I started in banking, and I was actually a bank manager. And when my bank got bought out, that's when I decided to pursue a career in radio. So it was actually, I didn't start pursuing a career in radio till about 6 or 7 years after I had finished. So our career paths were very different, but it's funny how we're both doing, what we really fell in love with at a young age. So it's very cool.
How that's so cool. My brother Marcus and I, we would do the radio shows and comedy skits too growing up. And so it's like, and having that kind of relationship and closeness to your brother, and kind of sharing in that similar kind of like career mindset. It's like, it's a real good motivator I found to have that happen too. And it's neat I can only imagine what it's like now for you guys to be both at like the peak of what you're doing and seeing like one another flourish in it. It's
Yeah, it's a lot of fun to see where we started and then to be where we are now. And we're both very, very lucky. And yeah, like you said, it's just it's funny how we both were able to succeed. So very lucky that I was able to happen.
well cool. When the bank job ended for you and all that stuff, how did you get your foot in the door? How did things start to get kicking for you to get on the right path that you wanted to be on?
Okay, so when my bank got bought out, and I still worked at the bank, but
Mhm.
with any kind of merger or buyout, I lost a lot. Like
Yeah.
I lost my seniority, I lost vacation time. And it was a completely different landscape. And I was like, man, it's probably now or never for me. I was already, just around 30 years old. So I was like, man, if I don't do it now, I'll never be able to do it. So I went to Connecticut School of Broadcasting to kind of just refresh, what I had learned in college. And I got an internship at WFAN, and it just built from there.
Nice, nice. And so how long were you into the radio business before like the Sirius XM and the wrestling stuff started coming about? How long?
A few years when I got an internship at WFAN, and then I started working at WFAN as a producer.
Mhm.
And then I left FAN and worked for the NHL, the National Hockey League. And then I got, because of Steve Cohen, who used to work at FAN, when he
Mhm.
started up the sports department at Sirius, he remembered me, called me, and then I started working for the NFL channel. And then it was in 2009 that I pitched the pro wrestling show. I had an idea, myself and Doug Mortman, and in 2009 is when we started Busted Open.
How about that? So, what were you? Did you start off as a sports fan, or were you a wrestling fan, or did they kind of coincide with one another in certain?
Both. I
Both?
mean, I was always a big wrestling fan since a young age, and I was always a big football fan.
Hmm.
So, to be able to say I worked for the NFL and then to work for pro wrestling, those were like those, I was always a big Cowboy fan for over 40 years. I've been a Cowboy fan, and for over 40 years, I've been a wrestling fan. So,
Yeah, it kind of
um,
does line up with one another. Marcus
yeah.
and I, we both became Cowboys fans, and then we became, hey, wrestling found its way like just a couple years or not even, What so as far as what kind of pitch did you make when you were like, hey, I want to do this wrestling radio show? I know up in the Northeast there was like John Rezzi's Pro Wrestling
Yeah.
Spotlight and certain things like that. Where was that kind of like a cool inspiration for you, or how did you come out kind of get with the pitch and get it out there for Sirius?
Well, when I worked for Sirius, there was no wrestling programming
Mhm.
at all. And this is 2009, so this is right before things kicked off with podcasts.
Right.
So there really wasn't an outlet for pro wrestling. And I remember my brother telling me, you got to find your niche. And my brother's niche was always hockey.
Yeah.
My brother was a big hockey fan, and not a lot of people talked hockey. So he was really able to develop a fan base through hockey and through the NHL. So it was the same thing for me. I was like, man, not a lot of people are doing, if at all. And I was always a wrestling fan, so I pitched the idea to Doug Mortman, who came on board with me to host, and then our the VP of sports, Steve Cohen, that, man, we should have some wrestling programming.
Mhm.
And he gave us an opportunity once a week for an hour, and it just built from there.
Now, did a lot of the connection with Sirius and all that, did that kind of help cultivate relationships with getting wrestlers on and certain things like that, or how did all that kind of start coming into play in a lot of ways?
You know what? My relationship with wrestling, as far as media,
Hmm.
started when I was with the NHL.
Really?
When I was working with the NHL, I noticed that a lot of hockey fans were also wrestling fans. So when I was working there, I would book a lot of wrestlers to come on the hockey shows that I was working on. And then when I started working on the NFL channel, same thing. I would
Hmm.
always find a way to get some of wrestlers on. And that's how I kind of developed a relationship with the WWE, with Joe Villa, who always was a big help PR wise early on. And so, yeah, I already had kind of developed relationships with the WWE, with TNA, especially Ring of Honor,
Hmm.
long before I started Busted Open.
I think that's very cool too, because I know recently you had a couple guests on there that were like long time that have been there since the beginning and stuff like that. Who were some of the big people that really helped wrestling wise that got like onto the show and kind of helped grow that audience even further than than what your goal was and stuff?
You know, Chris Jericho
Hmm.
was definitely somebody that helped our show early on. Chris Jericho is one of our earlier guests, and I remember he did an interview with TSN. I want to say 2010, 2011. And TSN's kind of like the ESPN in
Of
Canada.
Canada, yep.
And he mentioned our show on TSN. Also, he mentioned me and the show in his book Undisputed.
Hmm.
And he was always kind of like, that was probably one of the bigger names that kind of was a big supporter of our show early on, when we desperately needed people to kind of be a cheerleader for us. Chris Jericho was always in our corner. So I always appreciate Chris for that.
That's great. And like that, it kind of speaks to what he does nowadays too in AEW, where he's like getting the younger stars over from Action Andretti, and then even Ricky Starks just this past couple week to the week
Yep.
before here. It's just like really speaks to him, like just kind of, if you cultivate a relationship with Jericho, he seems to be, he'll be willing to throw a line out to you if needed be in anything like that. It's
Yeah,
cool.
and Ric Flair is another one. And Ric Flair is my all-time favorite wrestler. When I worked with the NFL, I would try to get Ric Flair on as much as possible. And he was another one that's always been a great supporter of Busted Open. So
What I wanted to ask too, I meant to ask you, since you grow up in the Northeast and everything like that, how did and you mentioned you all the time, like Flair's been your number one guy. How did it become to that? Like, how did you get associated with like Jim Crockett Promotions and that kind of like identity as a kid growing up?
well, I was always a fan of Georgia Championship Wrestling that was on TBS.
Okay.
And I think I've told this story on Busted Open before, but before I had ever watched any wrestling, I was probably about 10 or 11 years old. I was by my buddy's house,
Mm-hmm.
and he was watching Georgia Championship Wrestling. And he asked me, he goes, "Are you a wrestling fan?" And I said, "No, I've never watched it before." I said, "Isn't that fake?" And he was like, "No, no." He goes, "This is the NWA. The NWA is real." And he said, "The WWF is fake."
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, okay. So, early on, I would just watch NWA wrestling on TBS, and I wouldn't watch the WWF.
Mm-hmm.
And then as time went on, and I started reading the wrestling magazines and becoming a much bigger fan, then I started watching everything. But really, at Georgia Championship Wrestling, live from the TBS studios with Gordon Soley, that was like my first exposure of pro wrestling.
How awesome is that? Like it's a wild way to kind of get introduced to it too, because I mean, just as a kid for me, switching through the channels, and I saw Razor Ramon, and that's how I got hooked, and like it just all kind of cultivated from there. But like to see it, to get like the southern, the real passionate kind of aspect of it all, where it's like the diehard stuff. It's what a way to start off.
No, and it was I remember it was the summer of 1982. And then I watched it, and I've probably watched it every week since. Like I just, fell in love that day. And that started my love affair with pro wrestling.
Well, so I think what's really neat too, and something that I really like about Busted Open that and I kind of want to make this a two-part question in a way. So like growing up, I lived in North Myrtle Beach for like a year, and then they had, I think it was like the Bob and Tom radio show was down there or something like that. So like, and every morning on Fridays we'd get driven to school, and like I would hear them, and it would just be such a fun dynamic. And like Busted Open really cultivates that kind of like morning radio show thing that I think I really cherish a lot, and I think it speaks to a broader audience too. Plus, you cover the news on top of all that stuff.
Yeah, I think it's important. Like, for me, I always wanted to develop a relationship with the audience. So if we're just talking pro wrestling,
yeah,
well, then, then it doesn't really, we don't really able to cultivate that type of a relationship. So by having Mark and Tommy and Bully and Mickey and Thunder, like having them all kind of give their, personal side,
yeah,
well, then people can relate to them better. And, I know there's times where we could go off on tangents talking about movies or music, and that's not everyone's cup of tea. But I think it helps develop a personal relationship with the fans.
100%, because like you and Bully, even today, we're talking about Motley Crue, like and that albums and stuff like that, and people and music, and then you would like push back, like I'm not a big Motley Crue fan, and then Bully would get like that kind of dynamic, like going off against it. It just shows a relationship that people can relate to. And I think that's what I really like about the radio show itself. And I guess the question I want to ask is like, there was the concern, you mentioned it earlier, like podcasting is starting to come into play and people listen to that and tune into that. How big of a concern was that for you as like the podcast world grew and Sirius is still a strong presence, but how do you, and I think the radio show Busted Open really does differentiate itself kind of keeps to that classic radio show mentality, but also, you do talk about the news. How did you find that balance? And was it a kind of a concern for you starting off as podcast stuff grew out?
Well, I mean, like it was just myself and Doug Mortman, and we were just fans. And Doug is a very high executive with SiriusXM now. So his career path went in a completely different way. And as he was kind of fading out of Busted Open, that is really when the world of podcasting really started to grow. So it gave us an opportunity to bring big name people in. That's when we brought in Bully Ray, Tommy Dreamer, and Mark Henry. And it coincided with Stone Cold Steve Austin having a podcast and Chris Jericho having a podcast. So for me, I don't really look at the competition because we have a podcast and our podcast does very well, thankfully, but we are on SiriusXM. So that makes us a lot different than podcasts. We're able to take phone calls. We're live. It's a different dynamic. But I never looked at, Jim Ross's show or what Conrad Thompson does as any kind of competition. I always felt like we're all kind of the same family. And I still feel that way. Like I will put Jericho, Jim Ross, Conrad has been a guest on our show, Tony Schiavone, and I always promote their shows because I feel like the pro wrestling audience listens and watches everything. So, why can't they listen to Busted Open from 9 to noon every day or the replay later on in the day and still listen to these podcasts? Like there's plenty for everything to go around. So I use my platform, and obviously it's a big platform, but I also use it to promote everything else, because I still firmly believe the more successful JR's podcast, Mick Foley's podcast, Conrad's family of podcasts, the more successful they are, the more successful Busted Open will be, because I just feel like the pro wrestling world in general will become bigger and bigger. So I never look at these other shows as competition. I look at it like we're all kind of in this together. And that's always been my attitude.
I think, and that's a great thing to have too, because so much of this stuff, it can get competitive, whether you're in the radio business, in the wrestling business, in the writing business, anything like that. There's always you can always have that potential to be oh, I'm wondering what this person's doing this and I should be doing that. But then if you're just, just worry about what I'm working on. And I have my own path, and you had your own path, into radio. Your brother had his own path in the radio. And to your brother's point, it's find your niche. And Busted Open has certainly found its niche, also within wrestling, because you got the fans that can call in, and you've cultivated relationships with them, like Bama Dave and Savage. These are just names that I've become aware of listening to it. And so it's just all of that combined makes Busted Open stand out. But if you want to listen to get the Road Dogg's take on his stuff, or Kevin Nash, it's all different kind of flavors for everybody,
Yeah, and I think with SiriusXM, you have your hardcore audience, but then you're also going to have an audience. And I think a big portion of our audience is just people that are in their car and listening to SiriusXM, and then they found that there's a wrestling show. And I found that a lot of our fans don't even watch wrestling anymore.
Really?
They kind of just listen to Busted Open to keep themselves in that world, because it's in their blood. I know for myself, I listen to sports talk radio, but outside of football, I don't watch baseball. I don't watch NBA, but I know about it because I listen to sports talk radio. So I think there's a lot of fans that grew up watching wrestling. Wrestling is a part of their life. They like listening about it, but they don't necessarily watch each and every week.
That's a great point too, because it's just because you have truck drivers that are driving around listening to you all the time and stuff. I want to ask too, how did the relationship with Bully and Tommy and Mark, how did you kind of find that they were good at doing the radio and stuff like that? Because you see on ESPN and stuff, starting off, they had guys like Emmett Smith, and one of my all-time favorites and stuff. But a lot of those guys, sometimes it would work and sometimes it wouldn't. What made these guys work other than maybe in comparison to maybe some other ones?
Well, Bully, Mark, and Tommy were always guests on Busted Open. So I remember having a conversation with Mark around WrestleMania 32. I was out there in Texas, And I said to him, I said, you're an awesome guest. If you ever want to get into radio, I think maybe you should try it. And he told me, he goes, you know what? It's funny you said that. It's always been a dream of mine to be on radio. So I said, hey, when you decide that your career's over and you're retiring, give me a call and we could try to make something happen. Tommy actually did a lot of work at SiriusXM on the Fantasy Channel.
Oh.
So, you know, I kind of met him through that. I said, man, you should be doing, what are you doing? You should be doing some of our shows too. And then Bully was a guest, and we were on the phone, him and I, about the Okada Omega match from Wrestle Kingdom.
Right.
You know, this is going back 5-6 years ago. And we were kind of arguing about that match on the phone. And I said, you know, this would be great for radio. And that's kind of how our relationship started. And it's the same thing with Mickey and Thunder. They were always guests on our show. We kind of wanted to expand our roster. So those were the two people I thought of when we decided to add a couple more players onto our team.
It's pretty neat too, because I even like listening to Tommy and stuff. Sometimes when he's like flying solo and stuff like that, he does a great job of just picking up the ball when need to be, and like just being like, and kind of like running the show and taking the calls and fielding it all. Even like, I think it was yesterday or something, you had issues because you were going on the comedy show accidentally. It was getting into your ear. And then Tommy was like kind of filling in the space and stuff like that. It's just kind of neat to see the growth of that with the wrestlers there. What did you learn about radio that you learned from the wrestlers? Anything in particular that kind of stands out to you that they taught you?
Well, it's kind of like what you were just talking about. And the circumstance you're talking about is that we're doing the show, and then all of a sudden something got routed into my headset from another channel.
Yeah.
And I was here in the comedy channel. And, you know, we're live. So it's not like a podcast where something crazy happens and we're like, all right, let's edit that out when we do our final podcast. You know, you can't do it. It's live. So, and I think that's the same thing I could, you know, when I talk to the wrestlers, when they're in the ring, you know, they have thousands of people watching, or they're live on TV. Like, you kind of just have to roll with the punches. And, you know, I've learned that a lot being with these guys, and just learning how to do things on the fly, and getting people to buy into what you're selling. And, you know, there's a lot of relations between radio and wrestling, especially in a live atmosphere like Busted Open.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what makes it endearing too in a lot of ways. Is seeing like, okay, hey, Dave's having some issues, like what's going on? And like, I think that just adds to like, you know, the dynamic of the whole show in a lot of ways.
No, and I think that's what's special about the dynamic. Now, I could have been like, that's playing in my ear, and I could have like, all right, we got to go to a break. But I was like, let's have some fun with it. Let's make it part of the show. And let's bring the audience in on what's going on. And, you know, and I think that's, again, like, you found that funny. You know, if I would have just gone to a break, fixed the situation and moved on, but let's have some fun with it. Let's use it, and let's add to the dynamic. And I think that's what we did yesterday. And I again, that's what makes our relationship with our audience so special.
100%. So you're also a big music fan.
Yes.
How do you define, and I asked this question to Mickey too when I interviewed her, was about like, you know, what did she learn from music that she learned from wrestling? What did you learn a lot from music kind of getting into wrestling too? Or how did that do you kind of see them coinciding with one another for you?
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like, you know, they're two passionate fan bases, you know, like music fans and wrestling fans are very, very passionate. So it's just using that. And there's a lot of musicians that are fans of pro wrestling. So why not use that dynamic? Why not make that a part of it? Nita Strauss, who I think is one of the greatest guitar players out there now, she's a fan of wrestling. She's a fan of this show. Let's get her on. Let's make her, you know, part of the show. And you know, Lars Fredrickson, who from Rancid, who does Ruby Soho's music. He listens to the show every day. Let's bring him on. You know, Snake Sabo of Skid Row, big fan. Let's bring these people on. You know, Rick Ross a couple weeks back, heard it, and he called in to the show. That's the dynamic you can never get, anywhere else than on Busted Open, because we're live and we take phone calls. So it's in the moment. Let's use that passionate fan base and let's bring them up. Same thing with football. Derek Brooks, one of the greatest linebackers of all time from the Buccaneers, he's a fan of the show early on. Let's bring him on. Let's bring these people on. It's important.
Is there a bucket list guest, whether it's a celebrity or a wrestler, that you'd still like to get on? I know you've had Flair on there plenty of times and stuff, but
and I've been very, very lucky that I've been able to get pretty much every wrestler that I've ever wanted on, from The Undertaker and Flair to Shawn Michaels. But, the one wrestler that I have not been able to get on that I think everybody would love to get on is The Rock. I'd love to get The Rock, and it's not even about I grew up watching the territories. So I used to watch Polynesian Pacific Championship Wrestling, and it's so cool that I'm able to see that on the TV show Young Rock. I would love to get The Rock on just to talk Polynesian Pacific Championship Wrestling. Also, Mark Henry rode with The Rock early on in both their careers. I would love to get The Rock on to share some Mark Henry stories.
Right.
So I don't even want to talk about the WrestleMania matches with Stone Cold or, I would love to get some road stories about Mark Henry and some childhood memories about Polynesian Pacific Championship Wrestling.
That would be fantastic. Yeah. And to get a specific kind of thing that he knows about, and you can tell he loves it. He loves wrestling. Yes. So he adheres to all that. So really cool. Okay. So Busted Open, you guys signed on for 3 more years, right?
3 more years on SiriusXM. Yep.
What do you hope to still accomplish coming up, and what more do you have planned for Busted Open? How do you want to make it grow even further?
And that's just the thing. I want it to grow. We started out at, 1 hour once a week, and now we're live 6 days a week. I don't think of it as a show anymore. I think of it as a brand. I'm always thinking of, and then we have the merchandise, and we have at podswag.com. We have the podcast that's available for people who don't own SiriusXM. So I just kind of want to get the brand out there. I want to kind of get myself, Dave LaGreca, out there to do more. And I kind of love doing shows like yours. If people that, are just starting out in this game, I love that. I really want to make this, as big as possible. And again, I really want this community that we all are to get bigger and better and stronger.
It's pretty cool because you guys mentioned it today, and you mentioned it on the recent shows too. You guys got the chapter shirts that are coming out. So it's you're getting the different areas and stuff like that. And you cultivated a good fan base, and you've already have a good core base. And to your point, growing out the brand is the next big step to make it just accessible to all wrestling fans and everything like that. And
and you know what, what's a big thing for me, and it's something I want to do, Dominic, and I think it's important, is that I want this to grow, and I want it to be diverse. I want to be able to tap in to every wrestling fan. I want to be able to get into fans that are younger. Female fans. I want everyone to feel included. Inclusion is such an important thing for everything in our world, but especially pro wrestling. I still have so much to learn about people, and I'm learning too by working with a lot of people who are younger. So yeah. I want this to go well beyond me. I want this to go and so I want it to be as diverse as possible. When you think of diversity, you think of, race and color and creed and sexual orientation, and all that is important, but it's also age as well.
Right.
I want this to be appealing to a younger audience, that fan just like me back in 1982 that might just be getting into wrestling for the first time. And as a 51-year-old fan, I don't want to be closed-minded. I want to be open-minded. I'm ignorant to a lot of things, so I want to learn. I want to learn. I want to understand. I want to understand my fan base. I want to understand the people that listen to this show. So, I want the brand to grow, but like you said, I want the fan base to grow as well. Because if I'm just talking about one specific time, or I'm going to be the person that says, yes, wrestling was so much better back in my day, well, then you're shutting off an audience, right? By doing that. So I always say, like, I don't like it. I don't get it. But if you do, more power to you. Call in and tell me why. Because I think we could all learn from that too.
100%. Like, and and there's so many topics that you guys tackle, and that, like, I mean, obviously with the Vince Saudi stuff, like reports that ended up being false and all that stuff, but like there's so much stuff that people call in and weigh their opinions on. And I think what you do great, like if Bully gives somebody shit, a fan or a caller shit, like you kind of like, you're the balance of the scales where it's just like you connect with the fans. And I think that not only makes the listener feel like valued, but it shows like that their opinion matters too, and that you take the time to think about that stuff. And I think that extremely helps. And
and listen, there's times I go at fans too.
Oh, like, sure, which is funny.
That's the fun of it, arguing and going back and forth. But I don't want to stop doing this. I want to do this for another 10, 15, 20 years. Why not? But you know what? That's what's great about the dynamic that I have. I'm always going to be just a fan.
Right.
So look at, like, I have Bully Ray, Mark Henry, and Tommy Dreamer that are in their 50s. But then, then you have a Mickey James. And now we have a Thunder Rosa, who's in her 30s and still wrestling. Like, let's do that. Let's get younger. Let's get people that are just getting into it. I want to feel young, and I never want to lose that fandom, and I never want to lose that feeling. And listen, I didn't get to go to WrestleMania 27. I was on the air then, but we did all our shows in New York. So I never got to go to Atlanta at WrestleMania 27. The reason I bring that up is I fell in love with wrestling from Atlanta, Georgia Championship Wrestling. Yeah. But I've never been to a wrestling event in Atlanta. I've never gone to a wrestling event in Atlanta, and I am tomorrow night for Hard to Kill. Yeah. So like, here I am. I feel like a kid again. Like, I'm actually going to go to center stage, and I'm going to be, the old TBS studios. And like, that's the area that I fell in love with. And I've never been able to watch wrestling from Atlanta before. So I'm like all giddy. I feel like a young fan again. So like, I never want to lose that side of it. I never want to get jaded from that side of it.
And like keeping yourself in the thick of it too. And like you said, like getting the younger perspective and certain things like that always helps. Like, and and to be aware of that too is like, okay, that puts you ahead of the game too at this point in time.
Oh yeah, I'm definitely aware of it because I'm reminded of it because, like I am, 51. So like, but I want to understand, all right, this isn't what I'm used to, and I don't know if I like it, but so many people do like it. Look at the reaction it's getting from the crowd. All right, why is that? And let me try to understand that. Yeah.
100%. All right. Oh, what do you want to plug? Anything else? You guys got the master class. You have this tease going on. What do you want to plug here?
So if you're a subscriber to SiriusXM, listen to us 9 to noon every day, or 5 to 8 of the replay at night Eastern time on SiriusXM Fight Nation channel 156. If you don't have SiriusXM, wherever you get your podcast, Apple, wherever, we're available. The Busted Open podcast every day, Monday through Saturday, even Sunday with the Masters class with myself, Tommy Dreamer, Mark Henry, and Bully Ray. Busted Open merchandise is available at podswag.com. And Dave LaGreca merchandise is available on Pro Wrestling Tees. I have my hot sauce at Gemini Crow. So go to LaGrecasRage.com for my hot sauce. And I'm also available on Cameo. So a lot of ways to get in touch with me.
Hell yeah. Dave, you do a great job. It's always fun. And I can attest to it too, like listening every day. It's like busting open it. You got to make it part of your routine, guys. It's the good stuff. So happy 3 years, more years to you, Dave. And thanks to AdFreeShow members for tuning in.
Thank you.
All right.